Hi there. Excuse me. Hi there. My name is Eli, and I am just a average YouTube viewer who happens to be transgender, and I wanted to make this video to talk about some of the uniquely complex issues with the video. Let's get past. Let's all get past this confusion about trans people from the YouTube channel Professor Dave Explains. This was uploaded a few weeks ago. There's been some discourse back and forth with a few different content creators, but I don't feel like a lot of that's really addressed the meat of the issues as I see them, because unfortunately, even though the video is intended to be supportive of trans people, uh, the information that's presented is just not very accurate, and it's inaccurate in these ways that might not be readily apparent to folks who are just getting involved in this discussion, in this discourse. Um, Point of fact, I hate to say it, but pretty much all of the claims and arguments in the video that are presented as coming from like trans people and people who support us are not actually uh, arguments or positions that are either real or relevant. Instead, what we have in the video are repackaged mischaracterizations that have actually originated in right-wing propaganda and conspiracy theory circles. And that makes this really complicated because, there's an obvious contradiction here, right? Like, how does someone make a video to support trans people uh, but end up making a video that legitimizes and supports some of the very worst arguments used against trans people? And most importantly, how can we address uh, these kinds of problems while still supporting the effort and the intention to be a good ally? Because the thing is, to me, the kinds of mistakes that we see here are actually pretty common when it comes to engaging in political activism or political discourse for the first time, especially for white millennials or older. Um, Even though the because even though the misinformation and falsehoods that are presented here as fact are uniquely convoluted, I'd wager, they're still the same old recycled tactics to stoke fear and anger, and they've taken on different weird forms over the years, to such a point that there are just a lot of ideas about trans people that have floated around public consciousness for so long that they've become cemented as some kind of fact, despite having no basis in reality. Um, and yeah, that's like I said. I think what we see here is basically the unchecked acceptance of so much of this false background noise as truth, with again this contradictory intention to be supportive. So the result is understandably just a little bit messy. Uh, Wasps. Anyway, I've been doing plenty of whining and complaining about stuff in the comments and on the Twitters and all that, but that's not the best way to convey this kind of information, and I know that, and Lord knows I could have kept a cooler head. Because, yeah, even when you know, like, the right way to go about this kind of stuff, it's still really hard, and I wanted to apologize for forgetting to be compassionate and failing to demonstrate fully, I think, how uh, wonderful and valuable it is when someone who might not have any background or knowledge or experience with the subject but still knows enough to try to do what they can to help. And that's a beautiful thing, and I could have done more probably to appreciate that. Get it, Bibbs, get it. I just hope the cat gets that one. We have a lot of wasps out here right now. Most of the time, they just do their own thing if you let them be. But, when they come at you, you gotta take care of it. That's a handy little analogy for the right wing propaganda machine, I think, unexpectedly. You gotta pay attention enough to know what's going on and what you might be able to expect from whatever flavor of crazy they're drinking this week. Uh, but like most of the time, you just gotta let them do their own weird, kind of destructive thing until they just come right towards your face. But anyway, that might not be the best analogy. I'm not sure. Just a thought. But yeah, there are just a few things about this video, despite what I'm sure are good intentions, that make it uniquely dangerous, which is something that makes it have a real potential for harm rather than help. And that's this. Number one, the content from Professor Dave's channel is largely educational and usually really good. He even has several videos debunking certain conspiracy theories, so he would be an unexpected source of other conspiracy theory propaganda type information. He doesn't usually address political issues, so it might be safe to assume that this is something that at least some of his audience, might not regularly seek out, or they might not, regularly consume political content that addresses issues like this. So, for those reasons, I think it makes it much less likely for Dave's usual audience to question his opinions on the subject, the veracity of his sources, or for them to have any real frame of reference that might help them to identify the information in the video that they should ask questions about. So I think it's reasonable to assume that the ideas in this video would have a slightly different, possibly wider audience beyond the typical right-wing conspiracy theory audience. And when these ideas come from someone like Dave, someone with a brand built around being an accurate source for knowledge and information, it carries a lot more weight than when it comes from people like Matt Walsh, for example. And the last element to consider that makes this media content uniquely difficult to me is just, the state of the world in American society today. I mean, things are scary for trans folks right now. I think in the past year, there's been upwards of like 120 some odd pieces of legislation that have come up in well over half of the states in the U.S. The prospect of losing ground in terms of rights or social acceptance is very real. Like in my home state of Texas right now, they're literally trying to criminalize parents who seek to follow medical expertise in regards to supporting their trans children. It's a real problem. This isn't just a casual conversation to be had at one's convenience, because it has life and death consequences for real people. And to be clear, I wanted to just make sure that I stated directly, like when I talk about what trans people and our allies are saying, like I'm talking about public discourse that's relevant to stuff like writing and promulgating legislation, or refining medical or mental health care practices or procedures, or like how we talk about the stuff in education. So, you can see a lot of like what I'll be talking about in just from like public statements from organizations or institutions that deal directly with these issues, like or even ones that are just a part of it, like the APA, the American Psychologists Association, or groups that are like focus on queer, political change or something. All right. Anyway. Like Land Illegal, HRC, GLAD, P-Flag, things like that. You'll be able to find information like what I'm talking about, because I'm not trying to exclude or silence people in the queer community who might agree with Dave's characterizations, because I'm sure they do exist, but I'm just trying to provide a more accurate narrative the general political goals, not niche fringe areas that don't really enjoy support politically, or have any kind of popularity with the queer community at this time. So what I'd like to do here is talk about this stuff like I'm talking with a good friend who made a well-intentioned mistake, but with criticism that is also specific to creating media content that purports to support trans people. And hopefully this is a friend that is cool with sitting and chilling for, I think, like 40 minutes. I tried to put this together to make something quick and easy, but yeah, it's very complicated. So I'm trying to make it a good, well structured format, but unfortunately, I think it might take a little bit longer than what I had originally intended. But hopefully, my good friend will sit through that. So yeah, I think that would involve a little introduction to the world of these falsehoods and mischaracterizations about trans people, a little exploration of why these things exist, these falsehoods, what purpose they actually serve if they don't come from reality, and talk about like how this stuff shows up in our society today, what harm it poses. Excuse me. And with all that in mind, yes, Miss Bits, do you want inside? Inside? Okay, you just saw me. Um, so yeah, with all that in mind, and the hope that I can keep this video essay as short as possible, I'm not going to go point by point by point through each individual claim in the initial video, and I am only going to talk about the stuff in the initial video. Instead, I'd like to talk about three broad categories of misinformation as I see it, and that's historical misinformation, our contemporary misinformation, what's going on today, and how both of these things come together to form a very inaccurate characterization and context of this issue as a whole. And in each of these different categories, I'll talk a bit about the false narratives at the heart of the claims, talk about some examples from the videos, explain how those examples demonstrate support for those claims, even unintentional support. But first, I think it might be a good idea to kind of preemptively answer a question that I know I would be asking of someone making claims like this. Because yeah, I would say, wait, I've seen the responses to Dave's video. I know that he's made conservatives like Matt Walsh very angry. He's received a lot of backlash from right-wing anti-trans people as a result of his effort. How can you say that his video actually supports what those people are saying and believe, given their very loud and visible opposition to the video in itself and Dave himself? Well, this is one of those neat, weird little things about this and a few other forms of activism, but it really doesn't matter what the substance of your argument is. The basis of their position isn't formed in like a logical progression of integrating evidence-based reasons into their worldview. So yeah, like whatever like the substance of the argument is, if you've started the conversation by stating an overt goal to support queer people, or anything that demonstrates disagreeing with that block of people, yeah, it doesn't matter what evidence you have or how reasonable your argument is, because those kinds of beliefs don't have a rational basis. They're not formed logically, nor do they require any evidence. That's not how we develop those ideas and beliefs. And unfortunately, it is seldom, if ever, the means by which we can dismantle them. So yeah, you start with your support for trans people. Whatever you say after that point, it doesn't matter. The only listening that they're going to be doing is trying to pick up the points that they can put into their argument against you, which they're building in their head while you're talking, which really precludes any attempts to understand the argument itself. This gets very frustrating very quickly. And yeah, keep in mind one other side of the irrational and baseless beliefs, the nature of these kinds of beliefs, that having no basis in reality means that their position can and will shift very quickly when it comes to minor details or issues that are ancillary to their primary concern. And their primary concern is just to prove you wrong, to make you look bad, to, knock you down a few pegs. That's all it is. They don't. The substance of the argument will change, but the tactics and understanding will not. And I know that Dave is familiar with this kind of this aspect of confronting false narratives. Like when you prove these people wrong on one thing, indisputably, they'll or do they stop and acknowledge it? Do they consider what that means for their argument? No, they hop to the next thing and dismiss the value of whatever their previous point was. The thing that they might have been zealously pursuing as the thing that was certainly sure to defeat you. Yeah, as soon as it becomes useless to them, they drop it like a hot potato. And real quickly, something that I forgot to add is that even when those folks on the right are aware that they're not making a good argument, like, they might be aware that they just lost the point. Like, again, that's not really the point. Sometimes it's just to make the argument seem way more confusing than it really is. And when it comes to, like, the definitions of gender and sex, for example, this is a big part of that entire public discourse is the illusion that there's any kind of debate there at all, like that this is a complicated concept and stuff, but it's not. Like, being trans just means that your internal understanding of yourself, your gender, doesn't match your physical outside, your sex. And there's like all kinds of variations that can kind of be situated within that sort of a definition. But anyway, I don't think it's that complicated. And I think that, again, when we dig in and just keep pulling out points and jumping from point to point in these kinds of debates, yeah, sometimes it's not this just, what's the word? They're not just attempting to obstinate. Yeah, they're not just. It's not just pigheadedness and obstinate. Sometimes it's a part of the plan and the tactic to make. And we're required. We're a part of it. Unfortunately, this is where we have to stop and check ourselves and make sure. Like, are we feeding into what they want us to do? Do they want to make us upset and angry so that they can screenshot something out of context to demonstrate this? Look at this crazy, liberal person or crazy, trans person will pretend that they're going to use language that's respectful. But yeah, like, that's just side note. One of the things that happens, definitely a part of the tactics, something to keep in mind. So yeah, it's totally reasonable, I think, and 100% par for the course to see right-wing fear machine talking heads who don't understand or see the weird complexities of their own falsehoods and lies about anyone who disagrees with them. So yeah, all those reasons together, why I'm making this video, why I find it concerning, and why I think that if it has an impact, it's going to be more harmful than helpful. Yeah, we expect baseless nonsense from certain sources. When we get baseless nonsense from sources that we trust, it's more likely for us to accept baseless nonsense as indisputable fact. But I think we can do better. I think we all can do better. I know I've messed up in these ways before. I try to do better every day. You can see me messing up in these ways in a couple of instances in the Twitter comments, probably. Yeah, I think Dave can do amazing work with this topic, given the work that he's done in other areas with just a little bit more time, a little bit more information, because this stuff, it's so weird and complicated. It's just stupid, like, really and truly, with the boring reality of most trans people. And by boring, I just mean the amazing and beautiful existence that most humans get to enjoy in all of its mundane detail. We're not the crazy boogeyman people. I mean, I wish I had the kind of superpowers that those right-wing people seem to think trans people have, but another topic. All right, let's jump into the actual problems with this video. First, let's talk about the historical misinformation. So, the broad false narrative that we have here, the root conspiracy theory, is something that actually connects all the different right-wing conspiracy theory universes. And it's this really highly skewed narrative of the history of human development on Earth. In this narrative, humans have existed in this sort of monolithic, consistently progressive, ever-improving course of advancement. And this advancement is, in our technological progress, but also in our like moral, ethical progress. We are better now than we were in the past as humans, as a species. And this presumption of inevitable progress, it has every appearance of being good, or at least benign, right? Like, what is the harm in believing that humans are smarter and more capable now than we've ever been? Isn't that something that we can, like, see with our own eyes, given what we know about history? Well, the problem, it doesn't really come from this broad, vague, unprovable, and very much incorrect historical narrative. The problems show up when this very broad claim is applied to very specific situations and circumstances, right? So there's nothing wrong with believing that humans as a species are getting better. But when you take this and apply it to, say, the context of racial justice in America, you're going to find this strong narrative from the right-wing propaganda machine that they'll acknowledge that racism like was a problem at one point. They'll acknowledge that slavery was evil and abominable, and there's no excuse for it, except their excuse is that people just didn't know as well back then. People thought differently about humans and the whole system, so it's excused. um, get into that a little bit, but and so by that extension, like the efforts of Black people and people of color in the past to gain, the liberties that should be guaranteed to them as American citizens, that those were right and good, right? Like marching, protesting, to a certain extent. To now, that narrative is even getting washed away, but they're generally not going to be as openly, virulently supportive of older forms of racist practices, and they'll use this as a justification for why, like, contemporary racial issues to them are not really issues or not really problems. Because it's what happens when this false narrative butts up against reality, right? Because think about what it really means and how this it continues to be a way to, say, ignore the problems that continue to be expressed by people of color as well as other people who hold marginalized identities. If things are on this inevitable course of upward progress, then have we anything to do but wait for things to get better? And what does it say when people step out of line to insist that other people do things to accommodate our, desires? Like, does that seem reasonable? Does it seem rational? Does it maybe seem selfish? Because it's a part of how, like, people who are activists are characterized, like silly. Okay, all right. But anyway, that's a part of. Anyway, that is a part of this broader narrative, and it plays into the argument that you might hear defined as gradualism. Like, we can acknowledge things were bad in the past and that those other people made the mistake, but we're going to stop short of identifying the problems that we contribute to today, or taking any responsibility for the systems of power that continue to perpetuate inequity and injustice. Um, yeah, it seems like a weak connection, right? Just hold on a sec. We got more examples that from the video that I think might help illuminate this point a little bit more clearly. Okay, so from the video, there's 5 major false things that I'm going to talk about. One is the narrative, a historical narrative of trans people specifically, the narrative of queer progress in the United States in terms of social acceptance and tolerance, the false narrative of how gender roles have developed and how they're understood, how they have been understood, expressed by progressives, queer people, false narrative of how this debate has developed in the public and political spheres, and within that is a false narrative of the positions and arguments put forward by progressives, trans people, queer people. Um, so yeah, and I want to be clear too. For a lot of these points, it's not that Dave is making like a bad argument directly. It's more that like his claims will be entirely contingent upon those bad, false arguments being true. But there are a couple of points where he does make the bad arguments directly, which is that false narrative of trans people and queer people in general. So let's dig into that and why that is indicative of this right wing conspiracy problem. So when Dave talks about why it's taken so long for society to have reached this point of acceptance and tolerance for trans people, he cites the reason, the which, not to nitpick in terms of rhetoric, but I will in a minute, this is another example of language that needs to be trimmed up a bit. Because, like, for example, like, do you really mean to indicate that the only reason why trans people are have been subject to marginalization and persecution is because of our relative percentage of the percentage of trans people relative to the general population? Because like it doesn't fit. The evidence doesn't work, and it also paints again this picture of this sort of monolithic human group. Like Dave doesn't actually specify that he's talking about contemporary American society exactly, but I think that we can assume that based on everything else he's talking about, and then there's this unchecked presumption of Western dominance that, again, it's a thing that you find very very much in the right wing historical narratives. But this idea that humans ubiquitously, like all together in the past, like from the early points of human civilization, that it was a natural thing to reject trans people on some level, understanding that we didn't use the same language, of course, but anyone who deviates from this strictly dichotomous male-female understanding of gender, that human society as a whole roundly, othered them, us, and that because of those differences, like biases developed that were not true or real, but because the nature of trans people existing is a contradiction to these lies, that people will eventually come to realize that there's nothing wrong with it, and so eventually, like that's how we've gotten here. We've just gradually reasoned our way to this level of progress by nature of our human evolution. There's a problem with this. I mean, again, humans have not existed in a monolithic culture, and I know that Dave knows there's more than one culture and civilization on the planet, and I'm sure he didn't intentionally leave out all of the non-white ones, but that's a part of what this narrative does as well. It devalues, ignores, erases like so many civilizations that for any number of reasons might have differences that the colonial mindset would have taken issue with. So yeah, don't do that. Let's not erase the entire history of trans people throughout the world, because the idea that there has never been points of or civilizations or cultures that have made space for or had roles for trans people prior to this point. That's another one of those weird parts of this monolithic progression narrative where it's like, oh, you think you're silly for complaining about things now. You don't know how bad it was yesteryear. Yeah, it's another way of devaluing, delegitimizing these kinds of complaints, erasing the history of queer people in other cultures, erasing other cultures outside of our Western colonial post-Victorian civilization. And this gets kind of worse when Dave tries to use gay and lesbian people and like the change and growth of acceptance in society to demonstrate how this will eventually happen with trans people. He says this is a point where I think he even says directly that to some level, like homophobia isn't really a problem anymore, and that yeah, again, that this is simply a natural process in our evolution that we would become more accepting of people who are not actually doing any real harm to anyone, just by nature of that reality. Why would you hurt someone or oppress someone who isn't doing anything harmful to other people? This is a really nice thought. I guess maybe, but it's not how it's happened. It's not how it's ever worked, and I think it's a really really dangerous thing to communicate right now, because not only does this like erase the lives and history of every gay and lesbian and queer activist who has put their uh, blood, sweat, tears, and entire being into furthering queer rights over these past many decades. Like, that's just so gross. Please don't do that. We already have to deal enough with straight washing and all of that stuff without like this additional funky little theory to toss in the works, because yeah, there's no evidence to support it. It doesn't align with any kind of historical narrative outside of ones that you're going to find in like the 1776 report. And it's a part of this idea of America as this apotheosis of democratic ideals, where, of course, we will naturally solve all problems involving liberty and freedom because we have reached this peak of reason and enlightenment, and we are guided solely by reason and enlightenment. So why wouldn't we solve these problems? It's a weird dynamic. There's a non-religious end of this whole stuff that's just it's still weird to me. Um, okay, let's talk about the false narrative of how gender roles developed. Because this is like a weird, like, seemed like a slip in under the door kind of note where Dave said something to the effect of gender roles having, become obsolete in the Stone Age, only existing today because of misogyny and the desire to treat women like private property. Yeah. Um, Why? I haven't the idea of gender roles going obsolete in the Stone Age is that's a new one to me. Even the people who take issue with gender roles strongly as like a hegemonic power structure that disenfranchises women and stuff like that. Like they'll still tell you that gender roles have still played a pretty instrumental role in determining like people's places in societies. I mean, I'm from West Texas. The idea of our physical bodies being determinative in the careers that we choose is just not only expected, it's reasonable. And so the idea that gender roles have become obsolete, again, it's just, I don't know anyone who's making that argument, and I don't see how it's helpful because it really plays into this crazy leftist like let's subvert all of our formerly understood ideas of history. Like we're already doing that where we need to. Don't pull out the rug in the places that don't need it, man. Like this is not a thing. I mean, if you've got any evidence for it, cool. Because again, I've never seen anything to support that. Um, and yeah, it goes into support that characterization of trans people. I'll get more into that into the framing stuff in a second, but yeah, we have oh yeah, and a part of this whole idea of false characterization of how gender roles developed, it also goes into support this idea, like particularly because again, Dave kind of slides it in under there, but he mentions like agreeing that we should destroy gender roles and stuff, and um, yeah, again, that's not really a thing. That's not really an argument that anyone's really making. It's something that is a neat philosophical discussion in queer theory, but it's honestly something that like I haven't really heard from people in the queer community uh, in like 20 years, and even then it was like, the fun, like, nerdy queer people. And I mean, maybe it's just me and in Texas. But yeah, in general, I get the impression that this theory, even though it enjoys like a level of prominence again in those like academic classroom philosophical kind of levels of discourse, it's really not reflective of most trans people's experiences, because we're actually generally pretty attached to gender expression as an important part of our character and lives. It's just we don't want people forcing us to do gender the way they think we should. We just want to be able to do that. So the idea that we want to stop people from expressing gender the way they want to, yeah, I don't get that. It's not a thing. I mean, of course, like if the masculinity or femininity thing that we're talking about is something that's overtly harmful or toxic that hurts other people or the person engaged in the activity, yeah, sure, of course. But that's not really like arguing against gender roles. Like if you want to be hyper masculine, cool. You'll never see a group of guys more gleeful to do super masculine things for no damn reason than a group of trans guys. I guarantee it. And yeah, this furthers this idea that trans people are not just crazy, irrational, but we have this goal, this desire to um, be intrusive into other people's lives and to force them to do things that they're not comfortable with, to change how they live their lives just because we can't handle that they disagree with us, right? So yeah, we don't want to destroy gender roles generally. Again, this is something you can find people who do talk about this and advocate for it. You're not going to find this in much the way of like political discourse for yeah, what's going on right now, because it is all too often turned around and weaponized against us. And again, it doesn't actually enjoy any prominence or relevance as like a viable political movement or theory. Um, and it kind of, okay, I'm a slave to the cats, of course. Okay, and this plays into the broader, just general mischaracterization of progressive positions and arguments. So yeah, again, there's times when Dave, like, it's not necessarily that he is making the bad claim directly, and I think again that makes it more dangerous. And there's more of that stuff in this next part, talking about issues with misinformation surrounding contemporary issues, like what trans people. Okay, okay. Now if my cats have settled in somewhere, um, jumping into contemporary discussions, contemporary misinformation about what trans people are doing right now, political goals, uh, political or otherwise. This involves like the right wing propaganda conspiracy theory, involves a characterization of trans people, as I've said before, as mentally ill, overly emotional weirdos who basically just have a drive to destroy good old American society. None of our complaints or political goals are legitimate. We're just actively trying to insert our personal beliefs forcibly into other people's lives. So, for example, so many issues around non binary people just existing, right? In fact, like, I think we're often seen as attempting to subvert science and common sense. After all, uh, gender is a fact, is a scientific statement, right? Anything beyond man and woman is confusing, right? Like, I mean, yeah, this is something that unfortunately, for the vast majority of people, like they do experience in very much the same way. Their gender aligns with their sex, and everything that they've seen and experienced has affirmed that for them. So anything that deviates from it is too complicated or weird to be worthwhile consideration or accurate, and there's also this interesting connection between our like Christian white right wing, well, Christian white right wing is about right. Christian right wing, like nationalist groups, and the generally more liberal, like new atheist movement, people in that group, and certain parts of STEM culture and academia. Like they all have a weird relationship in that they all characterize social sciences as silly nonsense that's not legitimate or deserving of any real consideration or respect. It's almost like if you can't demonstrate your findings in like quantifiable data, if you can't express it mathematically, it's just vagaries and conjectures. And you know, if you can make stuff up, so can I. Blah blah blah. I mean, this is, and we see this like in how like new atheists like tend to approach religion. Where it's like, yeah, I don't have to study any of this stuff to like talk about it like I'm an expert because it's all make believe fairy tale bull anyway. And yeah, in STEM culture, not everyone in the sciences and stuff are uh, jerks, but yeah, there's this kind of perception, and you see it in uh, like, oh gosh, what's the guy? James Lindsay's one of these right wing talking head people. One of the people he likes to quote a lot, Doctor. Oh, I can't even remember it. But when you see people with doctor in front of their name and they're writing, you know, stuff that is about like how cultural Marxism is going to destroy America, or how critical race theory is the new satanic panic, whatever. They're probably going to have a degree in math or chemistry. And they will have never studied any of those things that they are going to write books about and judge. And yeah, like we kind of see something similar here, unfortunately. But again, this is something that we can find in certain liberal circles. So it might not be something that Dave is aware is an issue or a problem. So where do we see this in the video? From the very beginning, where we see when Dave gives definitions, some basic definitions to kind of provide some context for the argument before he gives an overview of the issues and stuff. And it's interesting because it's not really that, like, I think that generally, like, his definitions for sex and gender are pretty good. Like, they're pretty simple, but they convey, like, the basic ideas of, you know, sex being our physical expression of, you know, usually male or female, but, you know, in between at times with intersex folks, and gender as rooted in biological function, although he is very, very concerned with eliminating cultural considerations for the definition of gender, which plays into that anti-social sciences thing because it makes absolutely no sense. But we'll get to that. But otherwise, like I said, pretty good definitions. But then he does the thing where he characterizes these basically correct definitions as contradicting like what trans people and progressives believe or say. Like the idea that gender is rooted in biological function. I mean, yeah, that's pretty broadly understood and accepted. Like if it wasn't, it would really, really change how treatment for trans people is gone about. You know, think about it. Like if sex and gender really are, you know, capable of being decoupled, like wouldn't it be theoretically possible to have like some more flexibility with like our own expression and understanding of self? Yeah. So and this plays into like the right wing argument where they will basically use this characterization to, you know, say, I can't even keep all the nonsense straight, but, you know, to point out how ridiculous and hypocritical it is. Because, yeah, when you break it down, it would be ridiculous and really hypocritical. But again, it's not really a thing. Trans people are very well aware of the biological limitations of our bodies. I don't go to my doctor and demand to have a prostate exam. Trans women don't go to the doctor and demand to be treated as though they can get pregnant. That's not a thing. It's another part of the right-wing conspiracy world that is just silly nonsense that they make up to scare people. So yeah, trans people, yeah, we understand our biological functions and the limitations probably better than most other people. I'm gonna warrant. And again, we don't. There's not really a push to decouple sex and gender. And a part of what makes this problematic as a framing issue, again, is it positions trans people and our allies as, seeking to disrupt, destroy things that other people find comforting and reasonably don't find any problem with, because maybe they don't have any actual problems that we need to be dealt with. The whole gender as a social construct argument, when he talks about that, he's doing a bit of finger wagging at people on the left for using this phrase in the appropriate way given its development and context in the fields that it comes from. That he has accepted that the right wing lie and misrepresentation of this as a ridiculous statement, but it's not. It makes a lot of sense, and he acknowledges that in a way by kind of working around this weirdly and splitting gender roles and this idea of gender as a social construct, because that's all it means. And he addresses that a little bit later on, but it's just, again, one of those things that points out where his initial sources come from. Because they do not come from trans people or people that have exposure to these issues directly. And so we've got this preoccupation with just yanking cultural aspects of gender out of there. And again, it's not really logical. Under Dave's initial premise, you would assume, for example, that all female human beings in the history of the planet Earth have been born with an innate love of the color pink and frilly dresses and high heels and makeup and curls. But we know that those are not necessarily indicative of femininity. They are in our contemporary Western culture, but even within the context of Western culture, those things have all of them been expressions of masculinity at different points. That's what we mean by gender as a social construct, that cultural elements inform our understanding of gender expression, and that turns into how we express ourselves in terms of our gender identity. It's not that complicated, it's not that weird, it's perfectly rational, and the only reason why anyone who is as smart as Dave is would have such a strong negative reaction to it is if they have been listening to people who don't know very much about it talk about it and complain about it, which maybe that's the problem. Maybe he was just listening to all of these jerks talk about this stuff that they don't know about, and he knows enough to know that they're wrong, but stop short of gaining the real information he needs to make this a good argument. Let's talk about a little bit more about how this kind of supports these false narratives. Again, we have a positioning of progressives as contradicting or misunderstanding basic scientific concepts while upholding real progressive arguments and positions as some kind of new information that Dave is bringing to the table that nobody else has before. But, I promise, people have been making reasonable evidence-based arguments for a long time. It's just that, again, is not how we effectively dismantle these beliefs on its own. We have, poorly chosen language, and I think it's important to note that there's a part of this right-wing conspiracy theory thing that characterizes the left as trying to police language, and that might be what this sounds like I'm doing right here. But when you're creating media content that focuses on this issue in particular, but with any form of advocacy focused on supporting people who hold marginalized identities, language and rhetoric is really, really important. It's not something that we can dismiss or minimalize. Think of it like a mathematical equation. We can't grab and swap different numbers and throw them into different places just because it might look good or it sounds all right. It has to really work within the model context, whatever that we're doing, right? So the same is true with language. We can't be vague, we can't be imprecise, and especially when we're talking about things that, again, they are life and death. They do carry a huge, significant weight. And when we're flippant or lazy with our language, that conveys a level of disinterest in the actual problems that in and of itself is problematic, but also goes to further certain false narratives. Like when Dave gives his definition of trans people, like honestly, it sounds like a kind of definition that I might have heard like 20 years ago. The idea that being transgender means you just have a gender that is opposite of your sex. But if you notice, it's a really limiting way to phrase it. If we say that gender is opposite of sex, it necessarily means that we have two functions here, right? And you're either one or the other. And so again, we're stuck inside of this strictly dichotomous male-female paradigm of gender. And we've erased non-binary people in our definition. As well as intersex people, but even though like David made space for those in the previous part of the definition, like this kind of inconsistency again is going to be problematic. So, yeah, definitely important to make sure that our language, and there's some other language issues too, not just like within the video itself, but like around it, like how Dave introduced it on Twitter, the title itself. Like, for example, the title, "Let's all get past this confusion about trans people," as though confusion was the real issue here. Yeah, no, it's not. The tweet for the video upload. What are the chances that I can be the voice of reason? What are the chances? There's a lot of reasonable people that have already been working real hard that don't have the voice and outreach that you do. Yeah, another example of like the way our language in this is more conducive to right-wing propaganda than reality for trans people. This isn't a debate. Framing this as a debate is terrible to me. I really dislike that. Because a debate is something where you have two people trying to, you know, meet in the middle to a certain extent, especially politically. You're trying to find a means by which you can compromise to find a resolution that effectively addresses, as much as possible, the needs or problems on both sides, right? And when you set this issue up as a debate, there's this implicit understanding that, yeah, these are both two sides, that, you know, one may be stronger than the other, but there's still some kind of a rational basis for disagreement. There's not. I mean, there is, but not in the way that it's characterized here. And boy, that would be a whole other long-ass video to make. But yeah, like in this video, we have a bad case of both sidesing it, right? So like, it's not like Dave says both sides are, you know, equally valid and worthy of your consideration, but he spends equal time and energy in the video, and he gives much more, like all of his research time, all of his attention, all of his characterizations. Again, they come from the wrong sources. And this is problematic in another weird way, because when you're purporting to provide a balance of information regarding both sides, when there actually isn't anything that I can see that has anything to do, like that's come from trans people or our allies or anyone who's ever worked in any way with the community in literally any capacity, yeah, like, it's a double bad. So yeah, this is not a debate. This is a small part of the population who just want to exist and be left alone, and that makes people mad for some reason, and it's exhausting. There's another word for that that I won't jump in to say because we have enough. Yeah, even if I were to point out, like, that's literally the definition of, let's say, persecution. Like, God, well, you know what will happen is, if anyone cared enough to listen this far into it and to argue against it, they would, like, point out, like, oh, look, they want you to believe they're being persecuted, that their lives are so terrible, and that everything is wrong with America. And I haven't said those things at all. And anyway, so that's just an example. Like, I'm pointing it out and saying it there to point out why, like, I had serious thoughts about not saying it, and wrote it into my little write-out thing to not actually say that word, because it's just another thing that gets weaponized and used against us anytime we bring it up. So yeah, like this language, the language around the video and stuff, characterizes trans people as unreasonable. Because if Dave is the voice of reason, I'm guessing we haven't had any reasonable voices so far. As irrational, like let's all get past this confusion about trans people again. And when you give the context of the video is saying both sides are at fault in some way, like that both sides are having a hard time mm, listening to each other. That's the problem. That's not the problem. Um, yeah, again, this is a much more complex issue. And this video doesn't actually address any of the real problems that trans people are dealing with today. It misrepresents commonly held positions and arguments. It legitimizes irrelevant, false, and harmful narratives that have been weaponized against trans people, and even more so lately, but for sure in the past. And it misrepresents how cultural change comes about, how actual progress is achieved by effectively and very casually erasing the entire history of queer people in the U.S. and in the world as a whole. Literally, if you want to find support for Dave's historical narrative, you got to go to like the 1776 report, and I'm gonna guess that's not what he would want in terms of his content. Um, so yeah, I think it's important to note all of these problems can be avoided by engaging in advocacy which seeks to elevate the voices of people who hold marginalized identities. There's a lot of great examples of people right here on this platform who do a great job of exactly that. So please don't take this as discouragement intended to deter future efforts to support trans people. I hope that Dave can take this as it's intended, something to help him as he works to be a good ally, to help him, like if he wants to make more videos on the subject or to engage this topic anymore. Um, Because yeah, man, it's tiring. It's really tiring. I haven't even been very active on social media in a strong way for this very reason. Like it just like if you think you're tired of this, but hey, if you've got the energy to go after this, man, and if there's anything that I can do to help you do that in a more effective way, I'd love to. Um, yeah, it's a hard nut to crack, really. The implications here, yeah, there's some weird ones that aren't present in a lot of other conspiracy theories, I think. Um, so, good luck with everything. I hope that this was enough information to, give a general uh, overview of what these problems are and to hopefully start maybe some folks to looking into some other sources to build a better base of knowledge for these things. Because yeah, there's a lot of great information out there. It's so cool. As a I don't think of myself as an old person, but YouTube. I think in the context of YouTube, I'm probably really old. But yeah, no, it's great. It's fantastic. It's heartening. But also, there's still underrepresentation. Absolutely. So when people have a voice, when they have a platform, and when they have the trust of their audience to tell them the truth, man, especially when it's a life and death issue like this, please take that responsibility seriously. Please don't treat this like it is a casual debate that is a fun way to get clicks during Pride Month, or and if you want to get involved, like don't drop stuff in our laps and then leave us to deal with it, because that's all we get to do. You get to leave this behind. We get to deal with it. So keep that in mind too with future content. But anyway, I'm gonna go to bed now because it's late, and boy, this took a while.